Have you ever stood in a room full of people who treated you like absolute garbage, knowing that with just a few words, you could completely destroy their entire world? Well, that's exactly where I found myself on a cold Friday evening in November, and what happened next would change everything, not just for me, but for every single person in that room. Let me take you back to that moment, to that suffocating party where I smiled through gritted teeth while enduring insult after insult, mockery after mockery, all while holding the most explosive secret that would soon detonate their comfortable little reality. This isn't just a story about revenge, though I won't lie and say that wasn't part of it. This is a story about respect, about power dynamics, about the masks we wear, and about that intoxicating moment when truth becomes the most powerful weapon you could ever wield. I'm going to tell you everything, every excruciating detail, every emotion that coursed through my veins, every thought that screamed inside my head while I maintained my composure on the outside. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes silence is golden, and why the sweetest victories are the ones that nobody sees coming until it's too late for them to do anything about it. My name isn't important for this story, but what is important is understanding that I've worked in corporate consulting for 15 years, climbing ladders that seemed impossible to climb, breaking through glass ceilings that others said were unbreakable, and earning a reputation in the industry that opened doors most people don't even know exist. I've advised Fortune 500 companies, I've restructured failing organizations, and I've made decisions that affected thousands of lives. But on this particular evening, I was just another face in the crowd at what was supposed to be a casual networking event for a mid-sized tech company that had recently hired my firm to evaluate their leadership structure. Nobody knew me there, not really. They knew my firm's name, they knew we'd been brought in, but they didn't know my face, my role, or the magnitude of the decision I had made just 3 hours before walking through those doors. The party was being held at some upscale downtown loft with exposed brick walls, dim Edison bulb lighting, and that pretentious atmosphere that screams, "We're creative and successful," without actually demonstrating either quality. There were about 60 people there, mostly employees from various departments, middle management, a few executives, and the usual crowd of corporate climbers who attend these things hoping to be seen by the right people. I arrived alone, dressed casually but professionally, blending into the background exactly as I intended. My strategy was simple: observe, listen, get a final read on the company culture before our official recommendations went public on Monday morning. What I didn't expect was to become the evening's entertainment, the target of their jokes, the punching bag for their insecurities and cruelty. It started innocently enough, or so I thought at the time. I was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey that I had no intention of finishing, when a group of 3 men in their early 30s approached. They had that swagger that comes from mediocre success and inflated egos, the kind of confidence that isn't earned through competence but through years of being enabled by a system that rewards assertiveness over actual skill. The tallest one, who I later learned was named Derek from the sales department, looked me up and down with barely concealed disdain and asked if I was lost, suggesting that the real party was probably happening somewhere else. His friends laughed, that performative laughter that's meant to establish dominance and make the target feel small. I smiled politely and introduced myself by my first name only, mentioning that I was there for the networking event. That's when the second guy, stocky with a receding hairline and an expensive watch that screamed overcompensation, asked what I did for a living. When I gave a vague answer about consulting, he smirked and said something about consultants being people who borrow your watch to tell you what time it is and then keep the watch. More laughter, more aggressive posturing. I could feel the dynamic shifting, could sense that I was being sized up and found wanting in their eyes. What they didn't realize was that I was doing the exact same thing to them, cataloging every word, every gesture, every reveal of their character that they were so carelessly displaying. The evening progressed, and somehow I became a magnet for every insecure bully in the room. Maybe it was because I was alone, or because I seemed like an easy target, or because there's something about certain people that makes them feel powerful when they're putting someone else down. A woman from marketing, bleached blonde hair and a voice that could shatter glass, made a comment about my outfit being interesting, in that tone that clearly meant she thought it was terrible. Someone else suggested I looked like I worked in IT support, which they all found hilarious for reasons that revealed more about their prejudices than anything about me. Another person asked if I crashed the party because I seemed out of place among successful people. Each insult landed, Not because they hurt my feelings in the way they intended, but because they revealed so much about the toxic culture that had been allowed to fester in this organization. This was exactly the kind of environment that our assessment had identified as problematic, the kind of place where bullying was disguised as banter, where cruelty was mistaken for confidence, and where respect was something that had to be beaten out of others rather than earned through character. I kept my composure through it all, offering nothing more than polite smiles and non-committal responses. Inside, though, my mind was racing. I was thinking about the report sitting in my laptop bag, the one that detailed systematic leadership failures and recommended immediate termination of the CEO who had allowed this culture to flourish. I was thinking about the conversation I'd had just hours earlier with the board of directors, where I presented evidence of mismanagement, toxic workplace practices, and financial irregularities that could sink the company if left unchecked. I was thinking about the moment when the CEO, a man named Richard Castellanos, who these people worshipped like some kind of corporate deity, had been informed that his services were no longer required and that he needed to clear out his office before Monday morning. That conversation had been brutal in its own way. Watching a man who thought himself untouchable realize that his kingdom was crumbling, that the emperor truly had no clothes, and that all his loyal subjects were about to find out just how little their loyalty meant to someone who never deserved it in the first place. And here I was, surrounded by those very subjects, being mocked and insulted by people whose entire professional existence was about to be thrown into chaos because of the decision I had helped facilitate. The irony wasn't lost on me, and with each insult, each dismissive comment, each cruel joke at my expense, I felt my resolve hardening. These people needed to learn a lesson about humility, about kindness, about the danger of judging books by their covers. And I was about to become their teacher in the most unforgettable way possible. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something that would change everything for the people around you, but they had no idea? Comment below and tell me about it. Because that feeling, that weight of knowledge, it's something that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The party continued to swirl around me, voices growing louder as alcohol flowed more freely, inhibitions lowering, and the insults becoming even more pointed and personal. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, observing, documenting mentally, understanding with crystal clarity that this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every person who had ever been made to feel small by people who confused cruelty with strength, who thought that tearing others down was somehow a sign of their own elevation. Little did they know that the ground beneath their feet was about to open up, and the fall was going to be spectacular. I glanced at my watch, calculating how much longer I needed to stay to complete my observation, to gather just a bit more evidence of what I already knew to be true. The clock was ticking toward their reckoning, and with every passing minute I felt the anticipation building in my chest like a storm gathering strength before it breaks. As the evening wore on, I found myself drawn into more conversations, each one revealing another layer of the dysfunction that plagued this organization. There was Marcus from operations, a man in his 40s who spoke about efficiency and productivity, while simultaneously describing how he'd made an assistant cry earlier that week over a minor scheduling conflict, laughing as if psychological cruelty was some kind of achievement worth celebrating. There was Jennifer from Human Resources, ironically enough, who spent 20 minutes complaining about how sensitive the younger employees were, how nobody could take a joke anymore, how she missed the days when you could say whatever you wanted without worrying about feelings. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Watching the very person responsible for maintaining a healthy workplace culture openly mock the concept of basic human decency. I listened to stories of backstabbing, of credit stolen, of ideas appropriated, of people undermined and sabotaged, all delivered with a casualness that suggested this was just normal business practice, just the way things were done around here. And hovering over all these conversations like a benevolent deity was the specter of Richard Castellanos, their CEO, their fearless leader, the man who had built this culture and encouraged this behavior because it served his own ego and his own pocket. They spoke his name with reverence, with that kind of worshipful devotion that should be reserved for people who actually deserve it. Richard always says, they would begin, before launching into some pseudo-philosophical business nonsense that was really just justification for treating people poorly. Richard believes, they would continue, attributing their own toxic behaviors to the wisdom of their leader. Richard would never tolerate weakness, they would conclude. as if compassion and humanity were somehow character flaws rather than essential qualities of decent human beings. I began to understand that firing Richard wasn't just about removing one bad leader. It was about dismantling an entire system that he had built, a culture that would take years to rehabilitate, if it could be rehabilitated at all. Some of these people were too far gone, too invested in the toxicity, too comfortable in their cruelty to ever change. They would need to go as well, and I made mental notes of names, of faces, of particularly egregious behaviors that would need to be addressed in our follow-up recommendations. But for now, for this moment, I was content to let them hang themselves with their own words, to document their character through their own voluntary revelations. The insults directed at me continued sporadically throughout the evening, sometimes overt, sometimes subtle, but always present. Someone made a comment about my educational background after I mentioned where I went to school, suggesting it was a state school, in a tone that dripped with Ivy League superiority. Never mind that they themselves had attended a third-tier institution that nobody outside their hometown had heard of. Another person questioned my expertise in consulting, asking how many years I'd been in the field with a smirk that suggested they already assumed I was some kind of junior associate who didn't know anything. When I gave a vague answer about having some experience, the condescension was palpable, the assumption being that I was probably exaggerating whatever minor role I actually held. A younger woman from the design team who couldn't have been more than 25 actually patted my shoulder and told me not to worry, that everyone starts somewhere, and that if I worked hard and paid my dues, I might eventually become successful like them. The lack of self-awareness was almost beautiful in its completeness. This child barely out of college presuming to give career advice to someone who had forgotten more about business than she would probably ever learn. But I smiled and thanked her for her wisdom, because that's what the moment required and because I knew that her education was coming soon enough. The background to all of this, the story of how I even ended up at this party, is important to understand because it wasn't random, it wasn't accidental, and it certainly wasn't because I enjoyed subjecting myself to this kind of abuse. 3 months earlier, my firm had been approached by the board of directors of Tech Vista Solutions, the company hosting this party, with concerns about declining performance, high employee turnover, and rumors of a toxic workplace culture that was starting to affect their reputation in the industry. The board consisted of smart, successful investors who had been largely hands-off in the day-to-day operations, trusting Richard Castellanos to run the company effectively. But the numbers were starting to tell a different story, and so were the anonymous reports that were finding their way to board members through various channels. They hired us to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of the leadership structure, the organizational culture, and the operational efficiency of the company. This was my specialty, the kind of deep-dive assessment that requires getting beneath the surface, understanding not just what people say in formal interviews, but what they reveal when they think nobody important is watching. I had conducted dozens of these assessments over the years, and I had developed a methodology that combined traditional data analysis with anthropological observation. I didn't just want to see the numbers, I wanted to see the behaviors, the interactions, the unguarded moments that revealed the truth about an organization. So I insisted on a clause in our contract that allowed me to observe the company in informal settings without announcing my presence or my role. The board agreed, understanding that sometimes the truth only reveals itself when people believe they're not being evaluated. The first 2 months of the engagement were spent conducting formal interviews, analyzing financial data, reviewing HR records, and building a picture of the company from official sources. What I found was concerning but not conclusive. There were patterns of concerning behavior, metrics that suggested problems and enough red flags to warrant further investigation, but nothing that definitively proved the kind of systemic issues we suspected were present. Richard Castellanos was smart enough to maintain a certain level of plausible deniability, to keep the worst behaviors just hidden enough that they wouldn't show up in official documentation. He was charismatic in his way, the kind of leader who could charm board members and investors while creating an environment of fear and competition among his employees. He preached innovation while punishing anyone who challenged his ideas. He spoke about teamwork while pitting departments against each other. He claimed to value diversity while promoting people who looked and thought exactly like him. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable, and yet he had managed to maintain this facade for years. building a company that was successful enough to keep investors happy, while being toxic enough to churn through employees at an alarming rate. Those who survived learned to play the game, to embrace the toxicity, to become perpetrators themselves in order to avoid being victims. It was a perfect example of how power corrupts, how unchecked authority creates monsters, and how good people can be twisted into something unrecognizable when placed in the wrong environment. My investigation deepened, and I began to find the evidence I needed. I discovered patterns of discrimination that HR had swept under the rug, financial irregularities that suggested either incompetence or malfeasance, and a trail of settlements paid to former employees who had been mistreated badly enough to lawyer up. I interviewed former employees who had left the company, and their stories were remarkably consistent, painting a picture of an organization where cruelty was rewarded, where loyalty meant silence, and where questioning authority was career suicide. I built my case methodically, document by document, interview by interview, data point by data point, until I had an irrefutable argument for why Richard Castellanos needed to be removed from his position. The decision to attend this party was the final piece of my investigation, the opportunity to see the company culture in action without the filter of formal settings or prepared responses. I wanted to see how these people behaved when they thought they were among friends, when they believed nobody was judging them, when the masks came off and the truth came out. And boy, did the truth come out. What I witnessed exceeded even my worst expectations, confirming every suspicion I had developed over the previous months. The casual cruelty, the mockery, the bullying, the absolute lack of empathy or professionalism, it was all on full display. And the fact that I became a target of that behavior myself was almost poetic in its justice, giving me first-hand experience of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the culture that Richard had created. I could have revealed myself at any point during the evening, could have pulled out my identification and watched their faces drain of color as they realized who they'd been insulting, but I didn't, because I wanted to see how far they would go, how deep their cruelty ran, how comfortable they were in their toxicity. I wanted them to have no excuses, no way to claim it was a misunderstanding or that they were just having a bad day. I wanted them to reveal themselves completely, to show me exactly who they were when they thought there were no consequences for their actions. And they did. Oh, they absolutely did, with an enthusiasm that would have been impressive if it wasn't so disturbing. Every insult was another nail in the coffin of the culture Richard had built. Every mocking laugh was more evidence for my report. Every dismissive comment was another reason why the board had been right to bring us in, and why the recommendations I would be making were not just justified but absolutely necessary for the survival of the company. I thought about the meeting I'd had with the board earlier that day, just hours before this party, where I had presented my findings in a conference room that suddenly felt very small and very tense. I had laid out the evidence methodically, building my case piece by piece, showing them patterns they couldn't deny, data they couldn't dismiss, and testimonies they couldn't ignore. I showed them how Richard's leadership style had created a toxic culture that was costing them money, talent, and reputation. I showed them the risk they faced if they continued on this path, the lawsuits that were likely coming, the talent drain that was already accelerating, the damage to their brand that was becoming harder to repair with each passing day. And then I made my recommendation: immediate termination of Richard Castellanos as CEO, along with a comprehensive restructuring of the leadership team and a cultural rehabilitation program that would take months, if not years, to implement. The room had been silent when I finished, the kind of heavy silence that comes when people realize their worst fears have been confirmed, when they understand that the comfortable status quo is about to be shattered, when they know that hard decisions are unavoidable. One board member asked if I was sure, if there wasn't some way to coach Richard into better leadership, if we couldn't give him another chance to improve. I had expected this question, this desire to avoid the nuclear option, this hope that maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed. I answered with facts, with evidence, with the cold, hard reality that people like Richard don't change because they don't believe they need to change. I explained that keeping him would be sending a message to the entire organization that toxicity was acceptable as long as you delivered results, and that message would undermine any attempt to fix the culture. I told them that half measures wouldn't work, that you can't rehabilitate a culture while keeping the architect of that culture in power. It would be like trying to clean a house while someone was actively throwing trash on the floor. The board debated for 2 hours, but ultimately they knew I was right. They voted unanimously to terminate Richard Castellanos effective immediately, with me present to deliver the news and ensure a smooth transition. That conversation with Richard was one I'll never forget. Watching a man who had wielded absolute power suddenly realize that power was an illusion, that he was not indispensable, that his kingdom was built on sand. He tried anger first, demanding to know who had betrayed him, as if the problem was disloyalty rather than his own actions. Then he tried negotiation, offering to make changes, to be better, to fix whatever problems we thought existed. When that didn't work, he tried intimidation, threatening lawsuits and damage to our firm's reputation and consequences that would make us regret this decision. But none of it mattered because the decision was already made. The die was already cast, and nothing he could say would change the outcome. I watched him cycle through the stages of grief and fast forward, from denial to anger to bargaining to depression, all in the span of an hour. By the end, he was deflated, diminished, a shadow of the charismatic leader who had walked into that conference room thinking he was untouchable. He cleared out his personal items while security watched, and he left the building with an NDA and a severance package that was more generous than he deserved. But that was necessary to avoid prolonged litigation. And then, just a few hours later, I walked into a party full of people who worshipped him, who had no idea their world was about to change, who were busy insulting me without realizing I was the architect of their impending chaos. The irony was delicious, the timing was perfect, and the anticipation of what was about to happen was almost overwhelming. I nursed that whiskey and I smiled my polite smile, and I endured their insults while knowing that Monday morning was going to be a very different day for all of them. Some of them would survive the coming changes, the ones who were capable of self-reflection and growth, the ones who had been caught up in the toxic culture but weren't fundamentally cruel people. Others would find themselves looking for new jobs, discovering that their behavior had consequences after all, learning the hard way that loyalty to a bad leader doesn't count for much when that leader is gone. The party rolled on, music pulsing, conversations flowing, alcohol lubricating social interactions and lowering whatever remaining inhibitions people might have had. I found myself in a conversation with a group of middle managers who were competing to tell the most outrageous stories about employees they had fired or humiliated, as if cruelty was some kind of sport where keeping score made you a winner. One of them, a man named Bradley who managed the customer service department, described with obvious glee how he had made an employee work through her mother's funeral, suggesting that family emergencies were just excuses for lazy people who didn't want to work hard. The others laughed and topped his story with their own examples of how they had prioritized business over humanity, how they had demanded sacrifice without offering support, how they had treated people as disposable resources rather than human beings with lives and feelings and circumstances that sometimes required flexibility and compassion. I listened to all of this with a growing sense of clarity about what needed to happen next. These people weren't going to change just because Richard was gone. They were true believers, disciples of a philosophy that valued profit over people, that saw kindness as weakness, that measured success solely in numbers without considering the human cost of achieving those numbers. As the night progressed toward what I knew would be an explosive conclusion, the insults aimed at me seemed to intensify, as if the crowd sensed some kind of vulnerability, or perhaps they were just getting drunker and meaner as the evening wore on. Someone questioned whether I actually had a job at all, suggesting I might be unemployed and just attending the party for free food and drinks. Another person made a comment about my appearance, something crude and unnecessary that revealed more about their character than mine. A group in the corner started speculating loudly about why I was there alone, creating increasingly absurd and insulting scenarios that they found hilarious but that were actually just sad demonstrations of their creativity being channeled into cruelty rather than anything productive. Each insult added to my mental catalog. Each cruel comment became another piece of evidence. Each mocking laugh reinforced my understanding that the culture here was even worse than our formal assessment had revealed. I thought about all the employees who had suffered through this environment, the good people who had left because they couldn't take it anymore, the talented individuals who had been crushed by this machine of toxicity. I thought about the new employees who would be hired after the restructuring, who would get to experience a workplace that valued them as human beings rather than treating them as disposable resources. I thought about the potential this company had if it could just break free from the poison that Richard had injected into its veins. And I thought about this moment, this final observation before the truth came crashing down on Monday morning, and how every insult I endured tonight was actually just more fuel for the fire of change that was about to sweep through this organization. The clock on the wall showed it was getting late, approaching midnight, and I decided it was time to make my exit. I had seen enough, documented enough, experienced enough. The party was winding down anyway, people starting to leave, the energy shifting from aggressive revelry to tired intoxication. I set down my barely touched whiskey, preparing to slip out quietly, to disappear back into anonymity until Monday morning when my identity and my role would become very public indeed. But as fate would have it, I didn't get to make a quiet exit. Derek, the sales guy who had been one of the first to insult me, spotted me heading toward the door and decided to take one final shot, calling out across the room in a voice loud enough for everyone remaining to hear. He asked where I was going, whether I had finally realized I didn't belong, whether I was running away like I probably ran away from every challenge in my life. His friends laughed, others joined in, and suddenly I was the center of attention in a way I hadn't been all evening. The room quieted down, people turning to watch this final humiliation, this last bit of entertainment before the party ended. Derek swaggered over, emboldened by alcohol and the support of his audience, and he stood in front of me, blocking my path to the door. He looked me up and down one more time with that same contemptuous expression he'd worn earlier, and then he asked the question that would change everything. He asked who I thought I was, coming to their party, drinking their drinks, wasting their time with my presence. He suggested I was probably nobody, nothing, just another wannabe trying to climb a ladder I would never reach. And then he said something that crystallized everything, that brought all my observations and emotions and thoughts into perfect focus. He said that people like me would never understand what it took to be successful, that we didn't have what it took to work at a place like Tech Vista, that we would never be good enough to be part of their team. And in that moment, I made a decision. I had planned to stay quiet, to reveal nothing, to let Monday morning be the dramatic moment when everyone discovered the truth. But standing there with Derek blocking my path and his friends laughing behind him, with the remnants of the party watching this scene play out, I felt something shift inside me. Why should I wait? Why should these people get to enjoy their weekend in blissful ignorance while I carried the weight of what I knew? Why should I protect them from the truth for even one more minute when they had spent the entire evening demonstrating exactly why that truth was necessary? The decision to speak wasn't about revenge, not exactly, though I won't pretend that wasn't part of the calculation. It was about justice, about accountability, about the satisfaction of watching people confront the consequences of their actions in real time, rather than delayed by a weekend. It was about all the employees who had suffered in silence, who had been mocked and insulted and belittled by people just like the ones surrounding me now. It was about making a statement that cruelty has a price, that treating people poorly will eventually catch up to you, that karma isn't just a concept, but a force that operates through the actions of those who have the power to hold you accountable. I looked at Derek, really looked at him, seeing not just an individual but a symptom of everything that was wrong with this place. And then I smiled. A different kind of smile than I'd been wearing all evening, one that probably should have warned him that something had shifted, that the dynamic was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, not saying anything yet, just letting the anticipation build, letting him wonder what I was doing. I pulled up an email, the one from the board that had been sent just before I left the office earlier that day, the one confirming the termination of Richard Castellanos and authorizing me to begin the next phase of our engagement. I turned the phone around and held it up so Derek could see the screen, so he could read the email header, so he could see the official company letterhead and the signatures of the board members. I watched his expression change as he processed what he was seeing, confusion giving way to recognition, giving way to something that looked like fear, and then I spoke, my voice calm and clear, and carrying across the room in the sudden silence that had fallen. I told him my full name, my title, the name of my firm, and the nature of the engagement we had with Tech Vista. I told him that I had been conducting an assessment of the company's leadership and culture for the past 3 months. I told him that earlier today, based on my recommendations, the board of directors had terminated Richard Castellanos as CEO effective immediately. And I told him that I had attended this party as the final observation in my investigation, to see the company culture in action without the filter of formal settings. The words hung in the air like bombs waiting to explode, and I could see the information processing across not just Derek's face, but the faces of everyone else who was hearing this revelation. The room had gone completely silent, music still playing in the background, but conversation stopped dead. Everyone frozen in that moment of realization when everything they thought they knew suddenly becomes uncertain. Derek's face had gone from ruddy with alcohol and confidence to pale with shock, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, no words coming out because what could he possibly say? I continued, because now that I had started, I might as well finish. I told them that their behavior this evening had been documented as part of my assessment, that every insult, every cruel comment, every demonstration of the toxic culture had been noted and would be included in my final report. I told them that Monday morning was going to bring significant changes to the organization, and that those changes would not be limited to the CEO position. The explosion of reactions was immediate and chaotic. Some people started frantically apologizing, tripping over themselves to explain that they were just joking, that they didn't mean anything by it, that it was all just harmless fun and I shouldn't take it seriously. Derek himself seemed to shrink before my eyes, his bravado evaporating like water in the desert sun, his voice cracking as he stammered out excuses and justifications that sounded hollow even to his own ears. Others were angry, defensive, claiming that I had deceived them, that it was unfair for me to observe them without their knowledge, that I had somehow violated their trust by not announcing who I was. The irony of people who had spent the evening violating basic human decency, now claiming to be victims of unfairness, was not lost on me, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A few people were simply shocked, standing there in stunned silence, trying to process the information and what it meant for their futures. And a handful, a very small handful, looked almost relieved, as if they had been waiting for someone to finally hold people accountable, as if they had been suffering in this culture and were glad that change was finally coming. Jennifer from HR was particularly interesting to watch, her face cycling through emotions so quickly it was like watching a time-lapse video. She went from shock to denial to anger to panic, and then she tried to approach me with a professional demeanor, suggesting we should speak privately, that there might be misunderstandings that needed to be cleared up. I politely declined, explaining that everything I needed to document had already been documented, that my observations were complete, and that my report would speak for itself. She tried again, her voice taking on a pleading quality, talking about how she had worked at this company for 8 years, how she had a family to support, how she hoped this wouldn't affect her position. I didn't promise her anything because I couldn't, because whether she kept her job would depend on factors beyond this single evening, though her behavior tonight certainly hadn't helped her case. Bradley from customer service tried a different approach, attempting to justify his stories about employee mistreatment by framing them as examples of strong leadership and high standards. He seemed genuinely confused that what he had described as achievements might actually be viewed as failures of management and basic human decency. I let him talk himself deeper into the hole, each justification revealing more about his complete lack of self-awareness, each explanation demonstrating exactly why people like him needed to be removed from positions of authority. Marcus from operations took the coward's route, simply disappearing from the room as quickly as possible, probably hoping that if he wasn't present for the conversation, somehow the consequences might not find him. But they would find him. They would all find their way to him eventually, because that's how accountability works when people finally decide to enforce it. The young woman from the design team who had condescendingly patted my shoulder earlier was crying now, mascara running down her face, apologizing profusely and swearing she wasn't normally like this, that she had just been trying to fit in with the company culture. That last part was probably true, and it highlighted one of the saddest aspects of toxic workplaces, how they corrupt even good people, how they force individuals to choose between maintaining their values and surviving in the environment, how they create a cycle where victims become perpetrators, become victims again in an endless loop of dysfunction. I stood there in the center of this chaos, this storm of reactions and emotions that I had unleashed with just a few words, and I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, sadness, and resolve. Satisfaction because these people were finally facing consequences for their behavior, because the comfortable bubble of toxicity they had been living in was bursting in spectacular fashion. Sadness because I was watching human beings realize that their careers might be over, that their choices had led them to this moment, that they had spent years building something that was now crumbling around them, and resolve because I knew that what I was doing was right, that change was necessary, that sometimes you have to tear down something completely before you can rebuild it into something better. The party was effectively over now, people streaming toward the exits, some trying to catch my eye to apologize one more time, others avoiding looking at me at all, everyone suddenly very eager to be anywhere but here. I let them go, not trying to stop anyone, not making this moment any more dramatic than it already was. The damage was done, the message was sent, the truth was out. Come Monday morning, they would all receive official communications about the leadership changes and what they meant for the company. Some of them would be invited to be part of the rebuilding process, to help create a better culture, to demonstrate that they were capable of growth and change. Others would be shown the door, their services no longer required in an organization that was trying to become something different. And a few, the ones who recognized this as a wake-up call and took it seriously, might actually become better leaders and better people because of this experience. That was the hope anyway, though I knew from experience that real change was rare and difficult, and that most people would rather cling to their familiar patterns than do the hard work of personal transformation. Derek stood in front of me still, though everyone else had scattered, looking like he wanted to say something but not knowing what words could possibly bridge the gap between where he was and where he needed to be. I felt a moment of something almost like pity for him, seeing a man confront the reality that his behavior had consequences, that his cruelty wasn't consequence-free, that the world didn't revolve around him and his need to feel superior by making others feel inferior. But the pity was fleeting, replaced by a colder calculation about whether this person was salvageable or whether he represented a part of the old culture that needed to be completely excised. That decision would come later, after more analysis, after reviewing his entire employment history and not just this single evening. For now, I simply told him that he should go home, that he should think very carefully about his behavior and his choices, and that he should prepare for significant changes in the workplace when he returned on Monday. He nodded, looking shell-shocked, and finally moved out of my way, letting me walk toward the door that I had been trying to reach before this whole confrontation began. I stepped out into the cool night air, leaving behind the wreckage of the party, the shattered illusions, the uncomfortable truths that people would now have to wrestle with over the weekend. The city lights sparkled around me, indifferent to the small human drama that had just played out, and I felt the weight of the evening settling onto my shoulders. It had been necessary, all of it, but that didn't make it easy or enjoyable. There's no satisfaction in destroying people's sense of security, even when they deserve it, even when it's the only way to create something better. The deeper truth behind all of this, the story beneath the story, was something I had been carrying for a long time, something that made this particular engagement more personal than most, though I had tried to maintain professional objectivity throughout. Years ago, early in my career, I had worked at a company not unlike Tech Vista, a place with a toxic culture and a charismatic leader who encouraged cruelty disguised as competitiveness. I had been young, eager to prove myself, willing to do whatever it took to succeed, and I had participated in that culture, had made my own cruel jokes, had stepped on others to climb higher, had convinced myself that this was just how business worked, that nice people finished last, that compassion was weakness. I had been, in many ways, like Derek and Bradley and all the others at that party, believing that success justified any behavior, that results mattered more than methods, that the ends always justified the means. And then something happened that changed everything, that shattered my comfortable rationalizations and forced me to confront who I had become. There was a colleague, a talented woman named Sarah, who had been my friend once, before we became competitors, before the toxic culture turned us against each other. She was struggling, dealing with personal issues that she kept private, trying to maintain her performance while her life was falling apart. And instead of offering support, instead of being the friend she needed, I saw an opportunity. I used her vulnerability against her, undermined her in front of our boss, positioned myself as the reliable one while painting her as unstable. She was fired shortly after, and I was promoted into her position. I told myself it was just business, that I had simply been better at the game, that she would have done the same to me if our positions were reversed. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had betrayed someone who had once trusted me, had kicked someone when they were down, had prioritized my ambition over basic human decency. I carried that guilt for years, that knowledge of who I had become, that understanding that success built on someone else's suffering is hollow and meaningless. It changed me fundamentally, reshaped my values, made me question everything I thought I knew about business and leadership and success. I left that company, started over in consulting, and dedicated myself to helping organizations build cultures that valued people rather than consuming them. Every assessment I conducted, every recommendation I made, every leader I helped remove from power, it was all in some way an attempt to atone for what I had done, to prevent others from becoming what I had been, to create workplaces where people like Sarah could thrive instead of being destroyed. This engagement with Tech Vista had felt personal from the beginning, because I recognized so much of my former self in their culture, saw echoes of the person I used to be in the people who had insulted me at the party. The difference was that I had been given a chance to change, had experienced a wake-up call that forced me to examine my choices and my character. And now I was trying to provide that same wake-up call to others, though I knew from experience that not everyone would take advantage of the opportunity, that some people would double down on their toxicity rather than admit they were wrong. That's what made this work both necessary and heartbreaking, the knowledge that transformation was possible but not guaranteed, that you could offer people a path to redemption, but you couldn't force them to walk it. Standing outside the venue, watching the last stragglers leave the party, I thought about what Monday would bring, about the announcement that would go out to all employees, about the changes that would ripple through the organization over the coming weeks and months. There would be resistance, absolutely. People who had thrived under Richard's leadership would fight to maintain the status quo, would argue that the culture wasn't really that bad, would claim that we were overreacting to isolated incidents. But the evidence was overwhelming, the documentation was thorough, and the board was committed to the changes we had recommended. New leadership would be brought in, people with proven track records of building healthy cultures, leaders who understood that treating people well wasn't incompatible with running a successful business. Training programs would be implemented, policies would be updated, accountability measures would be put in place. It would be messy and uncomfortable and take much longer than anyone wanted, but it was possible to turn things around if everyone involved was willing to do the work. Some of the current employees would rise to the occasion, would embrace the changes and become champions of the new culture. Others would leave, either by choice or by necessity, finding their way to other toxic environments where they could continue their patterns. And a few, hopefully more than a few, would have genuine moments of self-reflection, would recognize themselves in the feedback they received, would make the difficult decision to change who they were and how they operated in the world. Those were the ones I held hope for, the ones who would make this whole painful process worthwhile, the proof that people could grow and evolve if given the right circumstances and the right motivation. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick email to the board, confirming that my final observation was complete and that my comprehensive report would be delivered as scheduled on Monday morning. I mentioned briefly that the evening had confirmed all of our previous findings and had provided additional evidence supporting our recommendations for extensive cultural reform. I didn't go into detail about what had happened at the party. That would all be in the formal report, but I wanted them to know that I was more convinced than ever that the path we had chosen was the right one. The response came back within minutes, despite the late hour, thanking me for my dedication to the engagement and expressing confidence in the changes we were about to implement. The board members knew this wouldn't be easy, that there would be pushback and resistance and people claiming we had gone too far, but they were prepared to stand firm, to prioritize long-term health over short-term comfort, to build something sustainable rather than continuing to put band-aids on a fundamentally broken system. That's what real leadership looked like, the willingness to make hard decisions even when they were unpopular, the courage to acknowledge when something wasn't working, and to take bold action to fix it. I walked toward my car, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the quiet street, feeling the exhaustion of the evening catching up with me now that the adrenaline was wearing off. It had been a long day, starting with that difficult conversation with Richard in the morning, continuing through the party and the confrontation, and ending here in this moment of reflection and anticipation. Tomorrow I would write my final report, would document everything I had observed and experienced, would make specific recommendations for which individuals could be part of the rebuilding process and which needed to be removed. It would be thorough and professional and backed by irrefutable evidence, but it would also be compassionate, recognizing that people were products of their environments and that changing the environment could change the people. As I drove home through empty streets, I thought about Derek's face when he realized who I was, about Jennifer's panic, about Bradley's confusion, about all the different reactions I had witnessed to that moment of revelation. I thought about the power of truth, how it could shatter illusions and force people to confront reality, how it could be both destructive and liberating at the same time. I thought about Sarah, my former colleague whose career I had helped destroy, and I wondered if she would approve of the work I was doing now, if she would see it as genuine redemption or just performative atonement. I had tried to find her years ago to apologize and make amends, but she had moved on completely, changed careers, built a new life far away from the corporate world that had treated her so badly. Maybe that was for the best. Maybe some wounds were too deep to heal through apology. Maybe the best thing I could do was ensure that others didn't suffer the same fate. The lessons I had learned from that experience with Sarah had shaped everything about how I approached this work. I understood that toxic cultures didn't create themselves. They were built by leaders who either actively encouraged bad behavior or passively allowed it to flourish. I understood that good people could do terrible things when placed in environments that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. I understood that changing a culture required more than just replacing one leader. It required a systematic overhaul of values, policies, and accountability measures. And I understood that the people who suffered most in toxic environments were rarely the ones with power. They were the vulnerable ones, the entry-level employees, the people from marginalized groups, the ones who couldn't afford to quit even when staying was destroying them. That's who I was really working for, not the board members or the executives or even the company itself, but the people who just wanted to do good work in an environment that didn't punish them for their humanity. This entire engagement, from the initial assessment to tonight's confrontation, had been about creating space for those people to thrive, about building a workplace where kindness wasn't weakness, where collaboration wasn't naivety, where treating people with respect was the baseline expectation rather than some aspirational goal that nobody actually pursued. When I finally got home, I sat in my car for a few minutes before going inside, letting the silence wash over me, processing everything that had happened. There was satisfaction in knowing that justice had been served, that people who had acted with cruelty would face consequences, that a toxic culture was going to be dismantled. But there was also sadness in recognizing how much damage had been done, how many people had suffered before action was finally taken, how long it would take to heal the wounds that had been inflicted over years of dysfunction. This was the reality of the work I did. It was never clean or simple or purely victorious. It was complicated and messy and full of moral ambiguity, requiring me to make judgment calls about people's characters based on limited information, to decide who deserved another chance and who needed to be removed, to balance compassion with accountability in ways that were never straightforward. But it was necessary work, important work, and somebody had to do it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the detailed work of documenting everything and making final recommendations. Monday would bring the public announcement and the beginning of the transformation process. And in the months to come, there would be the hard work of actually implementing change, of monitoring progress, of adjusting strategies when they weren't working, of celebrating small victories while acknowledging how much work remained. Have you ever stood up for what was right even when it was difficult, even when it would have been easier to stay silent? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments because that's really what this is all about. Finding the courage to speak truth to power, to hold people accountable, to demand better from our organizations and from ourselves. This story, this experience at Tech Vista, it's not unique. It's happening in companies and organizations all over the world, toxic cultures that persist because people are afraid to challenge them, because those in power protect their own, because change is hard and uncomfortable and requires courage that many people don't have or can't afford to demonstrate. But every time someone speaks up, every time someone refuses to participate in toxicity, every time someone holds power accountable, we move a little bit closer to the kind of work environments we all deserve. The people at that party, the ones who insulted me and mocked me and demonstrated the worst aspects of corporate culture, they're not monsters. They're human beings who made bad choices, who were shaped by a system that rewarded those choices, who genuinely believed that success justified their behavior. Some of them will learn from this experience and become better people. Others won't. and they'll carry their toxicity to new organizations where hopefully they'll encounter someone else who's willing to hold them accountable. That's the cycle. That's how change happens. Not all at once in some revolutionary moment, but gradually, person by person, organization by organization, through the accumulated actions of people who refuse to accept that cruelty is the price of success. I want you to understand something important. You have more power than you think. Whether you're an entry-level employee or a senior executive, whether you work in a small startup or a massive corporation, you have the power to influence culture through your choices and your actions. You can choose to be kind even when others are cruel. You can choose to speak up even when silence would be safer. You can choose to support colleagues rather than competing with them. You can choose to hold leaders accountable rather than blindly following them. These choices matter. They accumulate over time. They create ripples that spread further than you might imagine. And sometimes, if you're in the right position at the right time with the right information, you can create waves that transform entire organizations. That's what happened at Tech Vista. A series of choices and circumstances that came together in that moment at the party when I decided to reveal the truth instead of waiting until Monday. Was it the professional thing to do? Maybe not. Was it emotionally satisfying? Absolutely. Was it justified? I believe so, though I'm sure some people would disagree. But what matters most is that it worked. It created the conditions for real change. It sent a message that reverberated through the organization and beyond. I hope that some of the people from that party are reading this or hearing this or somehow learning from this experience. I hope they take time to really think about their behavior, about the kind of people they want to be, about the impact they have on others. I hope they understand that the insults and the mockery and the cruelty weren't just harmless fun. They were symptoms of a deeper dysfunction. They were choices that had consequences. They were opportunities to demonstrate character, and they failed that test. But I also hope they understand that failure isn't final, that people can change, that redemption is possible if they're willing to do the hard work of genuine self-reflection and transformation. That's the message I want to leave with you today. Be better than you have to be. Treat people better than the system requires. Stand up for what's right even when it's difficult, and understand that your choices matter more than you might think. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own workplace or your own behavior or your own experiences with toxic cultures, then please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever been in a situation like this, either as the victim of workplace toxicity, or perhaps as someone who participated in it and later regretted it? Have you ever had to make the difficult choice between staying silent and speaking up? What happened and what did you learn? I genuinely want to hear your stories because that's how we build community. That's how we support each other. That's how we create collective understanding of these complex issues. And if you found value in this story, if it touched something in you or made you think differently about workplace culture, please hit that like button because it really does help the channel reach more people who might benefit from hearing these stories. Subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales if you want more content like this, more stories about people standing up for what's right, more explorations of complex ethical situations, more real talk about the challenges we all face in navigating corporate culture and professional relationships. And make sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload, because I've got many more stories to share, many more truths to reveal, many more lessons learned through difficult experiences. Thank you for listening to my story, for investing your time in understanding what happened at that party and why it mattered, for being part of this community of people who believe that we can do better, that workplaces can be healthier, that success doesn't have to come at the cost of our humanity. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never forget that you have the power to make a difference in your corner of the world, no matter how small that corner might seem.